All right, so we are continuing on here with chapter 24. So in the first video, we kind of referred back to the reasons behind European exploration and movement in terms of trade and pushing for Christianity. And then we also looked at kind of the reasonings behind, what they found here in the New World, and what they were looking for, and kind of how that led to the, mistreatment of the indigenous populations, leading to the encomienda system, and then connecting that also to the conquest with the Spanish and how they were able to, very briefly anyway, very briefly mention kind of the factors that led to them taking over and then kind of setting up this new system. First, the encomienda, and then, as we said, the encomienda ends because of the mass treatment and the numbers of indigenous people dying as a result of the harsh treatment, as well as warfare, and also, again, the diseases that the Europeans are bringing over. So those variety of factors are what leads to essentially the end of the encomienda system, only to be replaced by other things. And so we also wanted to mention, and bring this up, and where we're going to really start looking here, is kind of how this creates a different sort of social class society that gets developed inside of the Americas. All right, and so you can kind of see here on this left side the social structure of the Spanish colonies, and you can kind of essentially also replay this in with the Portuguese colonies as well in Brazil. Obviously, just having a few different names due to the differences between Spanish and Portuguese languages. So the vast majority of people are going to fall under this category here, mestizos and mulattoes, which, again, you can kind of see as it's kind of written here, mestizos, people of Native American ancestry, or American indigenous ancestry, and European descent, so mixture of the two. And then mulattoes, who are people of mixed African and European descent. You can also maybe throw that in there a bit with indigenous as well as African descent as well. And then you have the native people and people of African descent who do not intermarry kind of at the bottom. All right, and so you can kind of see which one has, the most people, as well as, the fewest people, at the bottom has the most people in these two categories. And then, which one has the least amount of power, again, is the people at the bottom, people in the middle and the top, the Creoles, who are Europeans, people born of European descent, but they are born in, Mexico, within Cuba, within, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, anywhere else in, the Americas, but they have two sets, their parents are Spanish or Portuguese, and then at the top you have the Peninsulares, who are the people born in Spain or, Portugal again, moving over to the Americas to kind of oversee everything. All right, and so because you have this very large number of people, or essentially what we say is the large number of mestizos is aided by a sexual imbalance in the sense that you have more and more people being brought in from the Americas, and also from, or sorry, not from the Americas, but to the Americas from Africa as well as from Europe, and it's predominantly almost all male. There's not a whole lot of influx in terms of workers and overseers, government administrators, who are female that want to move or are particularly keen on moving. Same thing with, slaves, as they're not necessarily looking for, at this point anyway, people for reproduction. They're looking at just large number of manual laborers. Hence why this sets off a sexual imbalance of a very high number of males to females. Like the book, or at least one of the books I was looking at anyway, mentions a 7-to-1 ratio in just Peru itself. And this kind of it's very similar in a lot of other places as well within the Americas, again, where it's a very high male to female ratio. So you can kind of see, the offsetting. So here would be an example of maybe a mestizo or maybe a mulatto couple here, or family, all right, where, the father is, a European, and the wife could be, somewhat of American indigenous ancestry, or could be African American. I'm assuming it's predominantly supposed to, because it says mestizo, probably supposed to be American Indian, but again, I'm not 100% sure on that. And you can kind of see they make up that family. And so part of that is also the sense that a lot of indigenous women know that they will be better off if they marry a European, because that means that they'll be inside the home, they'll be protected, their children will be treated better as a result if they marry, essentially the white man. So it's kind of looking at, a protection of yourself and your family. All right. And so there's also different, levels within each of these different castes. And so again, you can even think about this in terms of, the Indian caste system, in terms of, who's on top, who's on bottom, who has the power, who doesn't. You can play this off with other types of, social class systems and divisions that we've already looked at. But with inside of, these mestizo and mulatto groups, all right, there's even kind of mini or miniature castes in there as well, based on racial heritage and skin color, because again, even though race is a social construct, it was very visual, And so essentially, the more light-skinned you were, the better off you were going to be treated. All right, and so this ends up making a lot of the some of the middle class, but mostly a large part of the lower classes, due to the fact that they were such large numbers, and the sense that Peninsulares and Creoles were trying to essentially prevent them from gaining more and more power. All right. Now, at the same time, some indigenous traditions do survive, including that religious syncretism that will end up happening in the sense that a lot of people, think about like the, Our Lady of Guadalupe, essentially being the Virgin Mary, but, a Spanish version of that or a Hispanic version of that in Mexico based on, more indigenous beliefs that, bring more and more people into the religion. So again, there's a lot of spiritualism that comes out of this that gets expressed now through Christianity as it gets passed on to the people. And again, part of that is again related to it, and there's a whole extra reading if you want that's on Schoology about why the indigenous populations were willing to take on Christianity, because again, that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later. But it's like, hey, why would you do that? All right. Still, there's other things as well within the Mayan and Andean people, leaving personal property to their female descendants. If you are a mother, you can leave it still to your daughters. Some of the household rules don't really change either. Parts of the diets that still change, and the way food is prepped doesn't really change. And then Indian male authorities at the most local levels, so we're talking like small villages and towns, still are able to have at least some sort of power over say in the affairs. Or the Spanish and the Portuguese don't necessarily have a whole lot of influence or don't really want to exert a whole lot of influence. So some of that is left in place. Now, at the same time, the Spanish, not the Portuguese, will build universities and schools, have printing presses, so that'll allow for more intellectual independence, connecting itself predominantly more to the Creoles and a little bit of the Mestizo culture. But again, it sets up the stuff that's going to help lead to the American revolutions, not the American Revolution like we talked about in 1776 in U.S. history, but the other revolutions that will happen following that, and the reasons why, because there is this intellectual movement, there is the establishment of these schools run by the church, so there's less reliance on Spain than other European colonies because they are forming their own independent culture as a result. Now, mind you, still controlled by people of predominantly Spanish descent, but that's not everyone or everything. So this helps up in the long run those independence movements, and who's going to run them again is the people predominantly of European ancestry, but having that mixture of culture within it. All right. So you can also see here on the right, this is either a Creole family or Peninsulare family. All right. So in the previous video, we also mentioned that what the encomienda system looked like, the treatment beyond that, and then that it got ended because of so many people dying, and as a result of the hard work, the labor, the mistreatment, and diseases. That gets replaced essentially by the haciendas, all right, which are these large Spanish estates that grow crops to sell to local villages and the mining communities that, again, we haven't talked to yet, but we will bring that in. And so to support them, you'd also begin to see a number of other people moving into the area to essentially offset this. So if these people are just growing crops, well, then, we have these massive growing communities. You need other supports as well. You need teachers for school. You need artisans. You need blacksmiths. Okay, blacksmiths for, building of, metalworks to help you mine and dig for supplies, horseshoes for horses and for oxen, artisans, help build buildings, create works of art, and be supplied and, paid by, the people at the large, Spanish estates at the haciendas. And so this is actually something that, anytime that you get a mining community or you get some other community, you have to have other types of support rather than just the people that are there to plant crops and, dig for resources. You have other people that are going to provide you for clothes, for food, for other things. And so this is kind of helped by that. So the haciendas are controlled by Peninsulares and Creoles, with these other groups essentially working on the labor jobs, and in terms of, again, that middle and upper class systems. And part of that comes in with the Mita system, especially, again, within Peru and in Ecuador and in South America, where we talked about the Mita system. You're working for the state, and the state provides these things for you, is essentially what gets the Spanish brought up. They do study the histories of the people, and they reimpose the Mita system to, again, keep this working, but this time now in the former Incan culture. All right, I have this image up here. So when we talk about this in U.S. history with sharecropping, it's essentially what debt peonage ends up becoming within the haciendas. Is essentially, you have this little bit of land that, if you are a mulatto, if you are, an African freed person or an indigenous freed person, you get to work the land and you get a little bit of side stuff, but they're going to continue to keep you in debt to essentially make sure that you're still working the land for, the Spanish, for, the Peninsulares and the Creoles, to keep you essentially in a type of slavery so that they have control over you. They have financial, social, economic powers, and you can't get out of the system. All right, and so that's kind of what this has done, and that's what that image shows, is how they end up entrapping them further and further down the road. It's still not the encomienda system, and the hacienda system eventually, gets put in with the debt peonage to keep these people centered here and essentially keep them one step above slavery. All right, so it's better treatment, but it's still a very poor social system to keep these people in terms of being second-class citizens. All right, now, this doesn't mean that people just passively took on and let the Europeans run the show. That's not at all what this was always happening. The biggest one, the most famous one, at least within the book, and that people that took AP US history with Mr. Getz, I know he focuses a lot on the Pueblo Pueblo revolt that occurs within the Americas. Because if we look back, I'm going to go back to this map right here. All right, you look at the territories that were essentially considered to be Spanish. Where do they have, influence? Essentially going almost all the way up, moving, at least with exploration, up into pretty much Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, but having settlements, into California, into Florida, New Mexico, Kansas, Arizona, Colorado. And so the Pueblo put up resistance to the Spanish, and essentially for a number of years in, I believe, the 1570s and 1580s, were actually able to kick them out for a time. Then the Spanish came back with a vengeance a few years later and brutally put down their resistance movement. So that's kind of what this image in the top left is here. But the Pueblos, they looked at both, Spanish soldiers, merchants, but also ministers, priests, and attacked them too, as an instance of saying, we're not going to let you just run our lives and our societies and our communities. We are going to fight back. And there were a number of other ones that occurred as well. Within the Incas, they successfully, or at least a group of them successfully, resisted for about 40 years after the fall of the Incan Empire. So in many cases, some of them were able to get away, including fleeing to the interior where the Spanish and or the Portuguese really could not get them. So fleeing further into the mountains, into the jungles of Brazil, inside the Amazon, within Florida, fleeing into, I'm struggling to think about that massive area within Florida, the swamps. I can't think of the actual technical name at the moment, and that's just kind of embarrassing. But, fleeing into those areas where the Spanish could not find them. All right. And then, the book also mentions the fact that many of them who had been trained and educated, especially those, within the areas that are taken over by the Spanish, asking and writing for the Europeans to, we know European laws, we have European languages, let's write to European leaders and ask them for relief, ask them for, assistance in creating better changes for the indigenous populations, for these other peoples within the society. And while that predominantly fell on deaf ears after, the change of the encomienda system, it showed that there were different ways that they could try to resist European changes, influences, systems in a number of ways that had, in most cases, very little effect, except for those that were able to essentially flee away from the system, all right? That were able to successfully get away from it and not necessarily be retaken or recaptured. So in the next video, we're going to talk about sugar plantations focused predominantly on Spain, and then move into the increasing types of African slavery, and then the books of the other European colonies and Christianity within there as well.